The ion storm outside the Karis mining outpost didn't just howl, it screamed with the voice of 10,000 dying banshees, all of them having a particularly bad day. Inside his battered, heavy-duty crawler, Silas Vane gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned the color of the permafrost outside. The heater, a relic of the pre-Union era that probably used more prayers than electricity, wheezed a lukewarm breath against his frost-bitten fingers. "You hear that, Barnaby?" Silas muttered, addressing the dented metal thermos magnetically locked to the dashboard. "That's the sound of a very expensive bad decision." Barnaby, being a vacuum-sealed container of mediocre coffee, offered no rebuttal. It was Silas's only friend on this godforsaken rock. Ever since the Synaptic Union decided that his department, maintenance and sanitation, was redundant, leaving him to rot as a freelance scavenger on the dark side of Velonis. He'd been talking to the thermos for 3 years. It was a better conversationalist than most of the corporate drones back at the hub. It never interrupted, and it never asked for a quarterly performance review. The windshield was a kaleidoscope of static and ice. Poker chip-sized flakes of frozen methane slammed against the reinforced glass. Silas was out here for one reason. Old Man Holloway's atmospheric scrubbers had crapped out, and the stingy bastard was paying triple credits for a midnight repair during a level 5 ion surge. Silas had bills. Silas always had bills. The landlord, a three-eyed slab of bureaucracy named Grack, had already threatened to vent his HAB unit's oxygen if the rent wasn't paid by dawn. "Just another turn, Barnaby. If we slide into the abyss, at least the coffee will stay warm for a bit," Silas grunted, downshifting as the crawler struggled up a jagged ridge of black obsidian. The radio crackled, a jagged mess of white noise punctuated by the occasional frantic warning from the sector authority. "All non-essential travel, hazardous conditions, seek shelter immediately." "Thanks for the update, Captain Obvious." Silas clicked the dial off. "Remind me to add professional death defier to my resume." A sudden gust of electrified wind slammed into the crawler's flank. The back end fishtailed, skidding toward a 300-meter drop into the lightless canyons of Karis. Silas's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He eased off the throttle, steering into the skid with the muscle memory of 20 years spent on the frontier. The heavy treads caught a patch of solid rock, and the vehicle groaned as it straightened out. That was when his floodlights caught something that made his brain stutter. About 50 meters ahead, slumped against a drift of glowing blue methane snow, were 2 figures. They looked like crumpled pieces of discarded silver foil against the oppressive darkness. Silas's first thought was that some miners had gotten stranded. His second thought, the pragmatic one that had kept him alive this long, was that they were probably already frozen solid. His third thought was a string of profanity that would have made a space marine blush. "Shit, shit, shit!" Silas pumped the magnetic brakes. "Barnaby, tell me I'm hallucinating." The thermos remained philosophically silent. Silas pulled the crawler to a halt, the hazard strobes blinking a rhythmic orange against the whiteout. He grabbed his high-output flashlight and donned his ion-shielding flannel, a garment that looked like a common lumberjack shirt, but was woven with lead-core filaments. He opened the hatch and the wind immediately tried to rip his skin from his skull. Trudging through the snow felt like walking through waist-deep molasses. Every step was a battle against the howling void. As he got closer, the flashlight beam danced over the figures, and the wrongness of the scene intensified. These weren't miners. They weren't even wearing pressurized suits. They were wrapped in a strange, shimmering fabric that pulsed with a faint, bioluminescent radiance. Silas knelt beside the larger figure. The skin wasn't flesh. It was a translucent, pale azure that seemed to hold the light of a distant star. Her hair, a cascade of liquid mercury, fanned out across the ice in patterns too geometric to be accidental. "Holy hell," Silas whispered. He touched the woman's shoulder. To his shock, she wasn't cold. She was burning with a feverish heat that seeped through his gloves. Her eyes flickered open, massive silver orbs that lacked pupils, reflecting his flashlight like twin mirrors. She spoke, but the sound wasn't human. It was a series of melodic chimes, like a glass flute being played by the wind. "Okay, definitely not local," Silas muttered. The second figure, smaller and more delicate, stirred as well. She looked like a younger version of the first, her blue skin flickering with a rhythmic pulse of distress. Silas looked back at his crawler, then at the two alien women who were either dying refugees or the elaborate hallucination of a man who'd spent too long talking to a thermos. "Barnaby, I'm about to do something spectacularly stupid," Silas groaned. He scooped up the first woman. She was impossibly light, as if her bones were hollow or made of carbon fiber. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and the silver hair spilled across his flannel. The smaller one flinched back when he reached for her, a rapid-fire sequence of sharp musical notes spilling from her lips. "Easy there, Sparky." Silas kept his voice low and steady, the way he talked to a temperamental engine. "I'm the only ride home you've got. You want to stay here and become a very pretty ice sculpture, that's on you. But I've got mediocre coffee and a heater that mostly works." The girl studied his face, her silver eyes scanning him with an intensity that felt like a biological X-ray. Finally, she nodded. Getting them into the crawler required a level of spatial Tetris. Silas hadn't practiced in years. The cab was designed for one grimy mechanic and his tools, not two glowing extraterrestrials. He wedged the smaller one between his seat and the console, draped the larger one across the passenger bench, and cranked the heater to its maximum, dangerous setting. "Barnaby, meet the new passengers," Silas said, settling into the pilot's seat. "Ladies, meet Barnaby. He's not a big talker." The smaller girl looked at the thermos, then back at Silas. She spoke a few melodic words that somehow conveyed a sense of dry amusement. "Yeah, I know," Silas said, putting the crawler into gear. "Trust me, if I had a therapist, they'd have a field day with this." The interior of Silas's hab unit was about as luxurious as a cargo container, which was exactly what it was. Located in the Rust Belt sector of Karis, it was a cramped space filled with the smell of ozone, stale grease, and a desperate attempt at domesticity. He had carried the two women inside, laying them on his single bed, a slab of foam that had lost its structural integrity during the Bush administration. The larger woman, whom he'd gathered was named Eris based on the rhythmic chime she kept repeating, was beginning to stabilize. Her blue skin had deepened to a rich indigo, and the soft glow was no longer flickering like a dying bulb. The smaller one, Vesper, was currently engaged in a systematic investigation of Silas's kitchen. She was poking a box of instant noodles with the suspicion one might reserve for a dormant landmine. "Don't eat the packaging, kid. It's the only thing with nutritional value in there," Silas grunted, tossing a thermal blanket toward her. Vesper caught it with a reflex so fast Silas barely saw her move. She looked at the fabric, then back at him, her eyes shimmering. Suddenly, Silas's cortex bridge, the cheap black market translation implant behind his ear, hit him with a surge of static. It was supposed to translate trade tongues, not the songs of an Argent Lattice refugee. "Warning, semantic drift. Protocol engaged." A voice, synthetic and hollow, echoed in Silas's mind. It wasn't the girl speaking. It was his brain trying to make sense of their telepathic resonance. Help. Us?" The voice was fragmented. "Yeah, I helped you," Silas said, leaning against the counter and rubbing his tired eyes. "Name's Silas. This is my palace. Try not to break anything. I don't have the credits for a security deposit." Eris sat up on the bed, her mercury hair cascading over her shoulders. She looked at Silas, and for a moment, the air in the room seemed to vibrate. "Silas," she repeated. Her voice was no longer just chimes. It was a haunting, melodic English, though the syntax was stiff. "You have performed the life rescue. The cold was ending us. We are Argent. We are the source." "The source of what? Problems?" Silas asked, though his heart wasn't in the sarcasm. Up close, they were terrifyingly beautiful. Not human beautiful, but like a piece of high-end machinery or a perfect sunset. "We are the architects of the lattice," Vesper chimed in from the kitchen, her voice lighter, more playful. She had given up on the noodles and was now staring at Silas's reflection in a dirty mirror. "But the overseer Malakor has erased the architecture. We are all that remains. We are the seed data." Silas blinked. "Right. Seed data. I'm just a guy who fixes carburetors, ladies. I don't do cosmic metaphors." Eris stood up, her movements fluid and silent. She walked toward him, stopping just inches away. Silas realized he was holding his breath. She was tall, her head nearly touching the low ceiling of the HAB unit. "By the laws of the Argent Lattice," Eris said, her silver eyes locking onto his, "the life rescue creates a singular convergence. You have preserved the data. Therefore, the ethel bond is established." The cortex bridge in Silas's head chirped. Translating concept, ethel bond, searching local equivalents, match found, marriage. Silas nearly choked on his own spit. "I'm sorry, what did the computer just say?" "We are now your ethel mates," Vesper said, hopping onto the counter with a grin that was far too mischievous for an alien refugee. "In your tongue, we are both your wives. It is the only way the energy can be shared. To survive, we must be anchored to you." "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" Silas held up his hands, backing away until he hit the HAB unit's reinforced door. "Hold the phone, Sparky. In Wyoming, well, where I come from, marriage is a whole thing. There's paperwork. There's a priest. There's usually a lot of crying in a very expensive cake. You can't just declare a three-way marriage because I pulled you out of a snowbank." "Is the cake necessary for the energy transfer?" Eris asked, tilting her head with genuine scientific curiosity. "No, the cake is... It's not the point." Silas paced the 5 steps his living room allowed. "I'm a 38-year-old grump who lives in a tin can. I have a thermos for a best friend. I am not husband material, especially not for 2 glowing space architects. Your biology is primitive, but your neural resonance is stable," Lyra observed, her voice softening. "Your mind is quiet. It is a good anchor for our frequencies. Without you, the Overseer's hunters would have found us in the static of the storm. Now, we are hidden behind your mundane signature." "Mundane? Hey, I've got plenty of personality," Silas retorted, then paused. "Wait, hunters? You mean someone is coming for you?" Malakor, Vesper's playful tone vanished. "He does not want the Argent Lattice to be rebuilt. He wants to reset the sector. If he finds the seed data, he will delete us, and anyone with us." Silas looked at the door, then at the 2 women. His pragmatic side was screaming at him to kick them out, to call the union authorities, to save his own skin. But then he looked at Eris's silver eyes and saw something he recognized. It was the same look he saw in the mirror every morning, the look of someone who had nowhere else to go. "Great," Silas muttered, grabbing Barnaby and taking a long, cold swig of coffee. "So I'm married to 2 aliens. I'm probably going to be deleted by a space warlord, and I still haven't paid the rent." "We can help with the resource acquisition," Eris said, pointing to Silas's broken toaster on the counter. She touched it, and the metal glowed with a soft, silver light. Within seconds, the rusted heating coils were replaced by shimmering, translucent ribbons of energy. "I have increased its thermal efficiency by 400%. Rule number 1, Silas pointed a finger at her. "Don't fix my stuff. The landlord gets suspicious if the appliances start violating the laws of thermodynamics." "Your rules are illogical," Vesper said, though she smiled. Before Silas could respond, a heavy thud echoed against the HAB unit's outer hull. It wasn't the wind. It was the rhythmic, metallic stomp of Union-grade tactical boots. "Silas Vane!" A muffled, gravelly voice barked from outside. "This is Grack. I know you're in there. Open up before I vent your atmosphere for non-payment of dues." Silas looked at the girls. Their blue skin began to pulse with a warning light. "Time to go?" Vesper asked, her eyes reflecting the tactical HUD of the men outside. "Time to go," Silas agreed, grabbing his tool belt. "But let's get one thing straight. If we're doing this, I'm driving, and Barnaby gets the front seat." "Agreed, husband," Eris said, and for the first time Silas didn't correct her. The sound of Grack's fist hitting the reinforced door of the HAB unit was like a sledgehammer striking a hollow drum. It wasn't just a knock, it was a rhythmic demand for submission. Silas Vane looked at the door, then at Eris and Vesper, who were currently radiating enough blue bioluminescence to be visible from low orbit. "Hide," Silas hissed, gesturing wildly toward the soot locker, a cramped, carbon-scored closet where he kept his spare filters and a half-functioning welding rig. Now, if that three-eyed bottom feeder sees you, he'll sell your location to the Union before the first credit even hits his account. Eris didn't move with the frantic urgency of a human. She glided. Her silver hair seemed to have a mind of its own, trailing behind her like a trail of liquid mercury. Vesper, on the other hand, grabbed Barnaby, the thermos, and ducked into the locker with a wink that suggested she found the prospect of hiding in a pile of industrial soot absolutely charming. "Silas!" "Shri," Grak bellowed, his voice muffled by the inch-thick titanium alloy door. "I can hear your air scrubber wheezing, you deadbeat. Open this hatch, or I'm cutting the life support. I've got a family of moldkin in Sector 12 looking for a unit, and they pay in actual marks, not excuses." Silas took a deep breath, adjusted his ion-shielding flannel, and cracked the door just enough to see Grak's unpleasant face. Grak was a Valonian, a species that looked like a cross between a toad and a tax auditor. He had three eyes, all of them currently fixed on Silas with predatory greed. "Grak, buddy pal," Silas said, leaning against the frame with a casualness he didn't feel. "You're early. The sun hasn't even hit the horizon yet. Not that we ever see the sun on this frozen marble." "Don't buddy me, Vane," Grak spat, a glob of neon green phlegm hitting the floor. "It's 6 in the morning. Rent was due at midnight. That's 6 hours of unauthorized residency. You owe me 2,000 credits for the month, plus a 500 credit late fee for making me walk through an ion storm. 500 credits for a walk?" Silas let out a dry, sharp laugh. "That's steep, even for a slumlord. Look, I'm working Old Man Holloway's scrubbers tonight. I'll have your scratch by noon. Just bug out and let a man sleep, will you?" Grak's middle eye, the one used for detecting thermal signatures, began to twitch. He pushed against the door, his superior strength forcing it open another few inches. "What's that smell, Vane? Smells like ozone and liquid starlight. You running an illegal fusion still in here?" "It's the heater, Grak. It's older than your grandmother and twice as temperamental," Silas grunted, putting his shoulder into the door. "Now beat it." "You're letting the heat out, and I'm not paying for the extra wattage." Suddenly the air in the room hummed. It was a low-frequency vibration that made Silas's teeth ache. Behind him, inside the soot locker, Eris was clearly having trouble suppressed her energy signature. A sliver of blue light, sharp as a laser, bled through the gap in the locker door. Grak froze. His eyes widened, all three of them narrowing onto that sliver of light. "That ain't no heater glow, Silas. That's Argent Tech. Or maybe a lattice core." His voice dropped from a bark to a predatory whisper. "You've been scavenging in the prohibited zones, haven't you? You found something high-end." "It's a lamp, Grak. A very expensive, very broken lamp," Silas lied, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Move aside," Grak commanded, drawing a short-range stun baton from his belt. "If you're harboring Union contraband, I get a 60% finder's fee. Or maybe I just take it and forget you ever lived here." Silas knew he couldn't win a fair fight with a Valonian. They were mostly muscle and thick hide. But Silas didn't play fair. He was a mechanic. He knew how things were put together, and more importantly, he knew how to make them fall apart. "Fine," Silas said, stepping back and raising his hands. "You caught me. It's a core. But be careful, it's leaking radiation. That's why the light is so blue." Grak sneered, stepping into the cramped hab unit. He headed straight for the soot locker, his greedy eyes fixed on the light. As he reached for the handle, Silas kicked the base of the modified toaster on the counter. 2 weeks ago, Silas had rigged the toaster to a secondary power cell for extra browning power. Now he triggered the emergency vent. A cloud of superheated breadcrumbs and ionized steam exploded into the room, obscuring everything in a dry, choking fog. "What the—" Grak coughed, swinging his stun baton blindly. "Now!" Silas yelled. The soot locker door flew open. Eris and Vesper didn't just step out. They moved like shadows made of light. Eris placed a hand on Grak's chest, and the Valonian's entire body stiffened as a mild electric pulse, just enough to scramble his nervous system, surged through him. He slumped to the floor, snoring instantly. "We have incapacitated the landlord," Eris observed, her voice calm and melodic despite the chaos. Yeah, and you just turned my rent problem into a kidnapping and assault problem, Silas groaned, grabbing a rucksack and stuffing it with basic tools, a few packs of synthetic protein, and Barnaby. We need to bug out. Grak's got a biolink. When his vitals stay flat for more than 10 minutes, the sector drones will come knocking. Where shall we descend? Vesper asked, appearing at his side. She was holding a piece of half-burnt toast from the floor, looking at it with fascination. The sink, Silas said, checking the hallway through the HAB unit's grainy security feed. It's sub-level 9, the deepest part of the mine that still has breathable air. The Union doesn't go down there because the sensors are all fried, and the inhabitants are, let's just say they're not the type to fill out paperwork. Sub-level 9, Lyra calculated, 3 kilometers beneath the crust. The atmospheric pressure will be 12% higher. Manageable. Don't give me the math, just give me your feet, Silas said, opening the back vent of the HAB unit. We're taking the pneumatic trash chute. It's a 60-meter drop into a pile of recycled plastics and industrial sludge. It's going to smell like a dead space whale, but it'll keep us off the main elevators. Vesper looked down the dark, yawning maw of the trash chute. Is this part of the Ethel Bond ceremony? Silas paused, looking at his 2 impossible wives. Sure, kid. In human culture, we call this the honeymoon. Now jump before the clankers get here. He went first, falling into the darkness with a scream that he hoped sounded like a battle cry, but was mostly just pure, unadulterated terror. He tumbled through a series of angled baffles, his ion-shielding flannel protecting him from the worst of the friction, until he slammed into a soft, malodorous mound of shredded polyfibers. A second later, Eris and Vesper landed beside him, looking as if they had just stepped off a luxury shuttle instead of a garbage slide. Eris reached out, brushing a piece of plastic from Silas's shoulder. Her touch sent a warm, tingling sensation through his skin, the Ethel Bond reacting to his proximity. You are damaged, she noted, her silver eyes scanning the bruise forming on his arm. I'm fine, Silas grumbled, standing up and dusting himself off. Welcome to the sink, ladies. Try not to look too much like royalty. Down here, light is a currency, and you two are carrying a fortune. The sink was a vast, subterranean cavern lit by flickering neon tubes and the dim orange glow of geothermal vents. It was a labyrinth of shipping containers, rusted-out machinery, and makeshift shanties. The air was thick with the smell of cheap fuel and fermented fungus. This was where the habrats lived, the miners whose lungs had failed, the engineers who'd lost their licenses, and the refugees from a dozen different wars that the Union had forgotten. Silas led them through a narrow alleyway where 2 men were huddling over a fire made of burning circuit boards. They looked up, their eyes widening as they saw the 2 glowing women behind the scruffy mechanic. Move along, boys, Silas barked, his hand resting on the heavy-duty plasma cutter at his belt. Nothing to see here but a few cousins from the outer rim. Those ain't no cousins, Silas, one of the men croaked, his voice a rasp of silica dust. Those are the silver glows. There's a bounty on the wires. 50,000 marks for any info on unusual energy signatures in Sector 7. Silas didn't stop. He leaned in, his face inches from the man's. 50,000 marks won't buy you a new pair of lungs when I vent the oxygen in this alley, Jax. Keep your mouth shut, or I'll tell Grak you're the one who's been tapping his power lines. The man paled and looked back at his fire. Silas kept moving, his heart heavy. 50,000 marks. That was enough to buy a small ship and leave Karis forever. The world was already closing in on them, and they hadn't even been in the sink for 10 minutes. They are fearful, Eris noted, her voice a whisper in Silas's mind. They're hungry, Eris. In this universe, hunger and fear are the same thing, Silas replied. They reached a heavy, blast-proof door at the end of a dead-end tunnel. Silas punched a complex code into the rusted keypad. The door groaned open, revealing a workshop that was significantly cleaner and better organized than his HAB unit. This was his black site, the place where he did the repairs that weren't exactly Union-approved. Make yourselves at home, Silas said, locking the door behind them. I need to check the long-range scanners. If the bounty is already out, it means Malakor's people aren't just coming, they're already here. Vesper walked over to a table covered in disassembled drone parts. She picked up a sensory array, her fingers dancing over the circuits. Silas? The man in the alley. He said we are the silver glows. Is that a human term for beauty? Silas looked at her, seeing the genuine curiosity in her eyes. He sighed, the sarcasm momentarily drained out of him. No, kid. It's a term for something that's worth a lot of money to the wrong people. It means your targets. He looked at Eris, who was standing in the center of the room, her silver light reflecting off the chrome tools on the walls. She looked like a goddess trapped in a basement. Why did you choose me? Silas asked suddenly, the question that had been gnawing at him since the storm. You're the architects of the lattice. You've got the seed data of a civilization in your veins. You could have chosen anyone, a union officer, a wealthy merchant, someone with a ship. Why a mechanic on a dying moon? Eris walked toward him, her footsteps silent on the cold metal floor. She placed her hands on his shoulders, and for the first time, Silas felt the full weight of the ethos bond. It wasn't just energy. It was a connection to a vast, ancient loneliness that mirrored his own. Because, Eris said softly, her voice resonating in his chest, when we were dying in the snow, others would have seen the silver and thought of the marks. They would have seen the light and thought of the power. But you saw two sisters who were cold. You gave us your flannel and your mediocre coffee. You chose us before the bond ever existed. And in a universe of architects, Silas Vane, we needed a builder. Silas looked away, feeling a lump in his throat he hadn't felt in years. Yeah, well, I'm still not paying for the cake. The black site was quiet, save for the hum of a localized frequency jammer Silas had scavenged from a crashed Union scout ship 5 years ago. He sat at his primary console, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. He was searching for any mention of the Argent Lattice or Overseer Malakor on the encrypted networks. Eris and Vesper were huddled near a stack of cooling units, their blue glow dimmed to a soft, pulsing navy. They were sharing energy, their foreheads pressed together in a silent communion that made Silas feel like an intruder in his own shop. Found it, Silas muttered, his eyes narrowing at a decrypted transmission from the Valoni's high command. The data was chilling. Overseer Malakor wasn't just a warlord, he was a correctional architect. His mission, sanctioned by the deeper, darker elements of the Synaptic Union, was to prune the unstable branches of the galaxy. The Argent Lattice, a civilization built on the harmonious sharing of energy and information, had been deemed a threat to the Union's centralized control. He didn't just conquer you, Silas said, turning his chair to face the sisters. He formatted you, like a bad hard drive. Eris pulled away from Vesper, her expression grave. Malakor believes that individuality is a glitch in the cosmic code. He seeks a singular, unified consciousness, his own. Our people refuse to integrate. We were the lattice. We believed in the strength of the mesh, not the dominance of the node. And you too, Silas leaned forward. You're the backup drives. We are more than that, Vesper said, her usual playfulness replaced by a sharp, cold edge. Eris carries the logic, the laws, the history, the scientific foundations of our people. I carry the resonance, the songs, the art, the emotional frequencies that give the logic meaning. Without both, the Argent Lattice is just a collection of dead data. And the ethos bond, Silas asked, gesturing between them, the marriage thing, is that part of the backup plan too? The bond is a seed chain, Lyra explained, walking toward him. In our world, an anchor must be chosen from the local environment to stabilize the transition. By bonding with you, our data signatures are encrypted with your biological noise. To Malakor's sensors, we don't look like Argent royalty anymore. We look like Silas Vane. So I'm a human camouflage net, Silas grunted. That's comforting. But if the bond is just for encryption, why does it feel like I can tell when Vesper is hungry for those terrible noodles? Vesper giggled, the sound like wind chimes in a summer breeze. That is the side effect, Silas. When frequencies merge, the boundaries of the self become porous. You are not just our anchor. You are becoming part of the mesh. Silas rubbed his face, porous. He liked his boundaries. He liked his lonely, sarcastic little world where the only thing he had to worry about was whether Barnaby was clean. Now he was the emotional dumping ground for two alien princesses who were also the last hope for a murdered civilization. We have a problem, Silas said, pointing to the screen. Malakor's elite hunters, they call them wraiths, have just landed at the main spaceport. They're not waiting for the local authorities. They're using bioscanners tuned to Argent frequencies. My mundane signature might hide you for a while, but if they get within 100 meters of this workshop, the game is up. We must move deeper, Lyra said, into the unmapped zones. The unmapped zones are unmapped for a reason, Eris, Silas warned. The structural integrity is zero, and the radiation levels are high enough to turn your insides into soup. Even with my flannel, we'd only have an hour before we started melting. I can reinforce your cellular structure, Vesper offered, her eyes glowing with a sudden, intense light. It is a temporary resonance. It will be uncomfortable for you, but it will prevent the radiation from breaking your DNA bonds. Silas looked at his hands. He was a man who lived by the rules of iron and oil. The idea of an alien woman reinforcing his cellular structure sounded like something out of a bad holovid. How uncomfortable, he asked. Like being toasted from the inside out, Vesper said brightly, but without the breadcrumbs. Fine, toast me, Silas sighed. But we need a distraction first. If we just disappear into the deep mines, the race will follow the breadcrumbs. We need to make them think we've left Karis. He stood up and walked over to a heavy, tarpaulin-covered object in the corner of the shop. He pulled back the cloth, revealing a sleek, albeit slightly rusted, long-range courier drone. This is old Bessie, Silas said, patting the drone's hull. She can't carry people, but she's got a high-output engine and a transponder I can rig to mimic your energy signatures. I'll send her toward the Valona's jump gate. By the time the wraiths realize she's empty, we'll be 40 levels down in the unmapped zones. It is a logical deception, Eris approved, but it requires a significant power source to mimic our resonance. I've got one, Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. He reached into his rucksack and pulled out Barnaby. Not the coffee, Vesper gasped, sounding genuinely horrified. It's not just coffee, kid, Silas said, unscrewing the base of the thermos to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside was a small, pulsing blue crystal, a piece of refined argentite he'd found years ago and kept hidden for a rainy day. I've been using this to keep my brew at exactly 82 degrees for 3 years. It's got enough juice to fool a wraith for at least 4 hours. He felt a pang of genuine loss as he slotted the crystal into the drone's power housing. It was the last piece of his old life, his only luxury in the cold dark of Karis. You are sacrificing your comfort for us, Eris said, her voice soft and heavy, with a new kind of weight. It's just a thermos, Eris. Don't make it weird, Silas snapped, though he couldn't look her in the eye. He finished the modifications, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a master gearhead. He programmed the flight path, bypass-coded the sector's automated flight control, and prepped old Bessie for launch through the workshop's narrow exhaust vent. See you in the next life, Bessie, Silas whispered as the drone's engines hummed to life. With a hiss of compressed air, the drone shot upward, disappearing into the dark shafts of the mine. Silas immediately turned to the sisters. All right, Vesper, do your thing. Make me a human glow stick. Vesper stepped close, her hands hovering just an inch from Silas's chest. He felt a sudden, intense heat, not like a fire, but like a vibration that started in his marrow and radiated outward. His vision blurred, the edges of the room turning into streaks of silver and blue. He felt a scream building in his throat, but it was trapped by the sheer pressure of the energy. Then, as quickly as it had started, the sensation faded. Silas slumped against the workbench, gasping for air. His skin felt tight, and there was a faint metallic taste in his mouth. Is it done? He wheezed. You are now resonant, Lyra said, her voice echoing as if from a distance. The radiation of the deep zones will not harm you for 3 hours. 3 hours, Silas checked his chronometer. It was 7 in the morning. We'd better move. If we aren't in the crystal caves by 10, we're toast, literally. They left the workshop, moving through the shadows of the sink. The atmosphere was different now. The desperation was thicker, the air colder. As they approached the entrance to the unmapped zones, a jagged hole in the rock marked with warning signs in 5 different languages, a shadow detached itself from a nearby shipping container. It was a seeker drone. It was a sleek, black orb, no larger than a human head, bristling with sensory needles and a high-intensity red eye. It didn't make a sound as it hovered, its eye scanning the three figures. "Don't move," Silas whispered, his hands slowly reaching for the plasma cutter. The drone's eye pulsed. It was analyzing their signatures. It stayed on Silas for a long moment, then flickered over Eris and Vesper. Because of the ethel bond and Vesper's reinforcement, the drone's logic gate hesitated. They didn't look like Argent royalty. They looked like a chaotic mess of human biology and industrial noise. But the drone was programmed for more than just signatures. It was programmed for anomalies. And three people standing still in front of a forbidden mine shaft was the definition of an anomaly. The drone emitted a sharp, high-pitched chirp, a signal to its masters. Then, its underslung turret began to rotate, a blue energy beam charging in its core. "Bug out!" Silas yelled, shoving Eris and Vesper toward the mine entrance. The drone fired. A bolt of concentrated energy slammed into the rock inches from Silas's head, showering him in sparks and hot stone. He pulled his plasma cutter, firing a desperate burst at the orb. The shot went wide, hitting a rusted support beam instead. The beam, weakened by centuries of neglect and the recent ion storm, groaned. It didn't just fall, it buckled, bringing down a massive section of the ceiling. "Silas!" Vesper screamed. Silas looked up. A 3-ton slab of reinforced concrete was descending directly toward the girl. Vesper, caught in the sudden flare of her own defensive energy, was momentarily paralyzed by the feedback. Silas didn't think. He didn't calculate the odds or run a cost-benefit analysis. He threw himself forward, his ion-shielding flannel snapping in the wind as he tackled Vesper, rolling her across the uneven floor just as the slab slammed into the ground. The impact sent a shockwave through the tunnel, throwing Silas against the far wall. The air was filled with dust and the smell of pulverized rock. The entrance to the unmapped zones was now completely blocked by a mountain of rubble. Silence returned to the tunnel, broken only by the distant dying chirp of the seeker drone, which had been crushed beneath the collapse. Silas lay on the floor, his chest heaving. Everything ached. He felt a trickle of blood running down his forehead, hitting his flannel and turning the red checks into a darker, darker crimson. "Vesper?" he coughed. "You still in one piece?" The girl crawled out from under a pile of smaller debris, her silver hair dusty but her eyes wide with shock. She looked at Silas, then at the massive slab that would have ended her. You jumped," she whispered. "The logic says the risk was 98% against your survival." "Why did you jump?" Silas sat up, leaning his back against the cold rock. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his favorite wrench, the one he'd had since his first day as an apprentice. It was snapped in half. "I like my boundaries, kid," Silas said, his voice raspy and tired. "But I don't like seeing my family get squashed by a ceiling, even the ones I'm only married to because of an alien backup plan." Eris appeared through the dust, her expression unreadable. She knelt beside him, her hands glowing with a soft, healing light as she touched his wounded head. "You said family," Eris noted. "Don't let it go to your head," Silas grumbled, closing his eyes as the pain began to recede under her touch. "It was just a figure of speech. Now let's figure out how we're getting through this wall. We've only got 2 hours and 15 minutes of resonance left, and I'm starting to feel a bit medium rare." As Eris worked on his wounds, Silas realized something. He had just traded his favorite wrench and a 300,000-mark drone for the safety of 2 people he'd known for less than 24 hours. For a man who prided himself on being a cynical survivor, he was doing a really terrible job. But as he looked at Vesper, who was now holding his broken wrench with a look of profound reverence, he realized he didn't regret it. He'd spent his whole life waiting for someone to stay for him. He never thought he'd be the one who stayed for someone else. "The wall is thick," Lyra said, her voice echoing in the small space they had left. "But I can feel a resonance on the other side. Something ancient, something that belongs to the lattice." "Great," Silas muttered, standing up with a groan. "Lead the way, wives. Let's go see what kind of cosmic trouble we can find in the dark." The air in the unmapped zones didn't just feel heavy, it felt ancient, like breathing the dust of 1,000 forgotten civilizations. Silas Vane led the way, his boots crunching over shards of glowing blue quartz that looked more like jagged glass than rock. Every breath he took felt like inhaling fine needles, a reminder that Vesper's cellular reinforcement was the only thing keeping his lungs from turning into a radioactive slurry. "You okay back there, Sparky?" Silas grunted, glancing over his shoulder. Vesper was trailing a few meters behind, her silver eyes darting around the massive cavern. The walls were lined with towering, bioluminescent crystals that pulsed with a rhythmic, deep-sea blue. It was beautiful, in a way that usually preceded a very painful death. "The resonance is singing, Silas," Vesper whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the vast space. "It's not just rock. These crystals were grown. They are the neural pathways of the first lattice seeding on this moon. They are mourning." "Great. Haunted rocks," Silas muttered, adjusting his grip on the heavy-duty plasma cutter. "Just what we needed to complete the tour. Eris, how much further to this ancient relay of yours?" "My internal thermometer says I'm hitting medium well, and I'd really like to stop being toasted." Eris, who was walking with a grace that made the treacherous terrain look like a ballroom floor, paused. She pointed toward a distant dark fissure in the cavern wall. "The signal originates from the Vault of Echoes. It is approximately 4 kilometers from our current position. The radiation levels there will be significantly higher, but the structural shielding is superior." 4 kilometers, Silas sighed. "In this terrain, that's a 2-hour hike. We've only got an hour and 40 minutes of juice left in my cells. We're cutting it close, ladies. Real close." They moved in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic thrum of the crystals and the distant, lonely groan of the moon's shifting crust. Silas felt the heat in his marrow intensify. It wasn't a fire, it was a vibration, a low-frequency hum that made his skin itch and his thoughts turn sluggish. He found himself looking at Eris and Vesper, wondering what they really were. They looked like women, spoke like poets, and moved like dancers, but they were essentially data wrapped in starlight. "Keep your head on a swivel," Silas said, his voice raspy. "The Wraiths might have ghosted our drone, but they aren't stupid. They'll have thermal satellites scanning for any heat bloom that doesn't belong in a dead mine." "Malakor does not use satellites," Eris said, her tone flat and academic. "He uses void hounds, entities of pure shadow that can track a single displaced photon across a parsec. If they find our trail, they will not stop until the resonance is silenced." "Void hounds. Wonderful." Silas kicked a piece of quartz. "Is there anything in your galaxy that isn't a nightmare in a cape?" "There was the Weaver song," Vesper said, her voice small. "It was a frequency that could make flowers bloom on asteroids. But Malakor burned the Weavers first." They rounded a bend in the tunnel and stopped dead. Ahead of them lay a graveyard, not of people but of machines. Hundreds of old Union mining drones, stripped of their parts and left to rot, were piled in a massive heap. Some were rusted red, others were scorched black by energy weapon fire. "This was the last stand of Sublevel 12, Silas said, his sarcasm momentarily silenced. "The miners down here didn't want to leave when the Union shuttered the operation. They tried to build their own colony. The sector drones were sent in to reclaim the hardware. They didn't bother moving the people first." Vesper walked over to a rusted excavator arm, placing her hand on the cold metal. Her blue skin pulsed, and for a moment the machine seemed to shimmer with a faint, ghostly light. "They were so afraid," Vesper whispered. "I can still feel the echo of their terror in the iron. They weren't fighting for credit, Silas. They were fighting for the right to belong somewhere." "Yeah, well, belonging is a luxury most folks can't afford on Keres," Silas said, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the junkyard. "Let's move. This place gives me the creeps, and that's saying something considering I live in a glorified trash can." As they picked their way through the rusted remains, a sudden sharp chirp echoed through the cavern. It was followed by the sound of grinding metal, a sound Silas knew all too well. It was the sound of a drone's sensory array locking onto a target. "Down!" Silas barked, tackling Eris and Vesper behind a pile of discarded cooling fins. A red laser grid swept over their position, missing Silas's head by less than 5 centimeters. From the shadows of the junk pile, a Mark IV Hunter Slayer drone emerged. It was a brutal piece of Union military hardware, a 3-legged tank bristling with Gatling lasers and sensory pods. That's a heavy-duty clanker, Silas hissed, checking his plasma cutter. And it's not a wraith. It's Union. Grack must have called in the sector militia. It is scanning for the Argent signature, Eris whispered. If it fires, the energy flare will alert every void hound in the sector. I've got to take it out quiet-like, Silas said, his mind racing through mechanical schematics. Eris, can you scramble its optics if I get you close enough? I would need to be within 10 meters to initiate a direct data intrusion, Eris said, but my movement will trigger its motion sensors. Not if I give it something else to look at, Silas said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his favorite lucky charm, a heavy brass lug nut he'd carried since he was 16. Vesper, when I throw this, you run for the left flank. Eris, you go right. I'll keep the tin can busy. It is a high-risk maneuver, Vesper said, her silver eyes shimmering with fear. I'm a mechanic, kid. My whole life is a high-risk maneuver. Silas grinned, though it felt more like a grimace. He threw the lug nut toward a pile of empty fuel drums on the far side of the graveyard. The metal-on-metal clang echoed like a gunshot in the silent cavern. The Hunter-Slayer's turret whirled around, its red eye pulsing with mechanical aggression. Go! Silas yelled. Eris and Vesper vanished into the shadows, their movements a blur of silver and blue. Silas stepped out from behind the cooling fins, waving his arms and whistling a shrill, off-key tune. Hey, scrap brain, over here! Your mother was a toaster and your father was a calculator with a low battery. The drone paused, its logic gate struggling to process the insult. Then with a mechanical shriek, it opened fire. Silas dove behind a rusted ore cart just as a volley of red lasers melted the air where he'd been standing. The heat was incredible, pushing his already toasting cells toward the breaking point. Come on, you bucket of bolts! Silas yelled, popping up to fire a quick burst from his plasma cutter. The bolt hit the drone's secondary shielding, doing nothing but making it angry. The Hunter-Slayer began to move toward him, its heavy legs crushing the rusted junk in its path. Silas retreated, leading it further away from the sisters. He was playing a dangerous game of hide-and-seek in a graveyard, and the Seeker had a thermal cannon. He tripped over a discarded hydraulic line, sprawling into the dust. The drone loomed over him, its turret depressing for the killing shot. Silas looked up, his heart thumping in his ears. Now, he croaked. Eris appeared on top of the drone's main chassis, as if she'd materialized from the air. She slammed her palm onto the sensory pod, her skin erupting in a blinding flare of silver energy. The drone's red eye turned purple, then white, as its systems were flooded with the logic of the Argent lattice. Vesper appeared at the drone's legs, touching the primary servos. The metal began to glow blue, the atoms themselves losing their cohesion. With a groan of tortured steel, the Hunter-Slayer collapsed, its legs turning into a brittle frozen lattice before shattering into 1,000 pieces. The machine died with a pathetic whimper of static. Silas lay on the ground, gasping for air. The heat in his chest was almost unbearable now. He looked up at Eris, who was still standing on the smoking wreckage of the drone. That was fancy, Silas panted. Remind me never to get on your bad side. Eris jumped down, her expression one of deep concern. She knelt beside him, her cool hands pressing against his burning forehead. The resonance is reaching critical levels, Silas. Your biology is starting to reject the enhancement. We must reach the vault immediately. Yeah, I hear you, Silas grumbled, pushing himself up. But look at the bright side. We're down one clanker, and I didn't even have to use my good wrench. They started moving again, faster now. The cavern narrowed into a long, twisting tunnel lined with jagged crystals that seemed to lean toward them as they passed. Silas felt a strange sensation in his mind. Not a voice, but a feeling of intense, crushing sadness. It was the echoes. They were getting closer to the relay. Silas, Vesper said, her voice trembling. I can see it now. The vault isn't just a relay. It's a memory core. It holds the names of everyone who lived in the lattice. Malakor wants it because if he can delete the names, our people cease to exist in the history of the stars. Then we'd better make sure he doesn't get the password, Silas said, his vision beginning to swim. They reached a massive circular door carved from a single piece of dark, non-reflective stone. It was covered in pulsing silver glyphs that seemed to dance in the air. This was the entrance to the Vault of Echoes. I cannot open it, Eris said, her hand hovering over the door. It requires a biological anchor that is not of Argent origin. It was designed this way to prevent Malakor from accessing it alone. You mean it needs a human? Silas asked, leaning against the doorframe. It needs a choice, Lyra corrected. A sacrifice of will. To open the vault, the anchor must offer their resonance to the door. It will take a portion of your vitality, Silas. It will hurt. Silas looked at the silver glyphs, then at the two sisters who had become his unlikely family in the space of a single day. He thought about the 50,000 marks he could have had. He thought about his quiet, lonely life as a junk mechanic, and then he thought about Vesper looking at a broken wrench as if it were a holy relic. Well, Silas said, pressing his palm against the cold stone door, I've already spent my luck on a bad crawler and a talkative thermos. Might as well spend some vitality on a couple of space princesses. The door didn't just open, it screamed. A wave of white light erupted from the stone, washing over Silas and dragging the breath from his lungs. He felt as if his soul were being put through a centrifuge. The names of 1 billion Argent citizens flashed through his mind, a dizzying, beautiful, tragic map of a lost world. He fell to his knees, his hands clawing at the stone. The heat was gone, replaced by a cold so intense it felt like his blood was turning into ice. Silas! Vesper's voice was far away, muffled by the sound of 1,000 weeping ghosts. Then the pressure vanished. The door slid upward into the ceiling with a silent, heavy grace. Silas collapsed onto the floor of the vault. The air here was perfectly still, scented with the smell of ozone and old parchment. In the center of the room sat a massive, crystalline spire that reached toward the ceiling, pulsing with a soft, steady white light. We are inside, Eris said, her voice filled with awe. Silas looked at his hands. They were shaking. The blue glow was gone from his skin, replaced by a pale, sickly gray. He felt older, as if he'd aged 20 years in 20 seconds. Did we win? He wheezed. Vesper knelt beside him, tears of liquid silver running down her cheeks. You gave it to them, Silas. You gave the door your strength so they could keep their names. You are the most foolish, wonderful human in the galaxy. Yeah, Silas grunted, trying to find a sarcasm. Just make sure. They spell my name right in the history books. Silas, with a capital S. As the sisters began the process of uploading the data to the relay, Silas lay on the cold floor, looking up at the crystalline spire. He had lost his luck, his vitality, and his favorite thermos. But for the first time in his life, he felt as if he were exactly where he was supposed to be. The Vault of Echoes was a sanctuary of light, but outside the darkness was moving. Silas could feel it in his bones, a cold, oily sensation that told him the Voidhounds were circling. Eris was standing at the base of the spire, her hands merged with the crystal. She looked as if she were part of the machine, her eyes closed and her body glowing with a brilliant, blinding white light. Thousands of silver data streams were flowing from the relay into her skin, mapping the history of her people into her cellular structure. Vesper was guarding the entrance, her eyes shimmering with the gift of foresight. She kept flinching, her head jerking as if she were seeing flashes of a future she didn't want to accept. They're coming, Vesper whispered. 5 minutes. No, 4. The wraiths, they are not like the Union drones. They are the absence of light. Silas struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on a protruding piece of the spire. He felt like a piece of scrap metal that had been left in the rain for too long. All right, we need a plan. Eris, how much longer on the download? 300 seconds, Eris said, her voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. I must integrate the final lattice. If I stop now, the names will be lost forever. 5 minutes, Silas looked at Vesper. Kid, I need you to listen to me. I can't fight those things. Not like this. I'm running on empty, and my plasma cutter is down to its last 3 charges. Vesper turned to him, her face pale. Silas, the ethel bond. I didn't tell you everything. I was afraid. Silas felt a cold pit form in his stomach. Afraid of what? The bond isn't just camouflage, Vesper said, her voice trembling. It's a conduit To keep us stabilized in this biological form, we have to draw energy from the anchor. Usually an Argent noble bonds with an Argent warrior. They are designed to handle the drain. But a human, your nervous system wasn't built for this. The drain, Silas repeated, his mind flashing back to the intense heat in the sudden cold. You're saying you're burning me out. The more energy we use to fight, the more we take from you, Vesper cried, grabbing his hand. Every time Eris scrambles a drone, every time I reinforce your cells, it takes years from your life. By opening that door, you gave up more than just vitality. You gave up your future. Silas looked at his hands again. The shaking hadn't stopped. He understood now. The ethel bond wasn't a marriage. It was a parasitic link. He was the battery for a dying civilization. Why didn't you tell me? Silas asked, his voice surprisingly calm. Because the logic said you would leave us, Eris said, her eyes opening. She looked at him with a sadness that was deeper than any ocean. And we were so close to the end. We thought we could reach the relay before the cost became too high. Silas let out a short, dry laugh. Logical, efficient, very Argent. He walked over to the rucksack, pulling out Barnaby. The thermos was empty, the coffee long gone, but he held it anyway. It was the only thing in the room that wasn't trying to save the galaxy or drain his soul. So, if I cut the bond, Silas said, what happens to you? We would dissipate, Lyra said. Without an anchor, our biological shells would fail within 10 minutes. We would become echoes in the static of the moon. Silas looked at the door. He could hear it now, a sound like velvet scratching against silk. The void hounds were at the threshold. You have a choice, Silas Vane, Eris said, her voice regaining its strength. The bond can be severed by your will alone. You can walk out of here, back to your shop, back to your life. You might live another 40 years. You might find a human wife and have children who don't glow in the dark. And you two? We will stay with the names, Eris said. We will be remembered as data, not as sisters. Silas looked at the door, then at the two women. He thought about Grack and the rent. He thought about the 50,000 marks. He thought about the way Vesper had laughed at his jokes and the way Eris had healed his wounds without asking for a single credit. You know, Silas said, checking the power cell on his plasma cutter, I've spent my whole life being mundane, just another cog in the Union machine. Nobody ever asked me to save anything. Nobody ever thought I was worth anchoring to. He stepped toward the entrance, standing between his wives and the approaching shadows. I'm a mechanic, Silas said, his voice hard as granite. And a good mechanic never walks away from a job until it's finished. If the cost of this family is a few years off my life, well, I was probably just going to spend them talking to a thermos anyway. Vesper let out a sob, throwing her arms around his waist. Silas, you are so stupid. You are the most stupid being in the universe. Yeah. Tell it to my tombstone, Silas grunted, his eyes fixed on the door. The darkness arrived. It didn't come with a bang or a flash. The silver glyphs on the door simply turned black, and the air temperature dropped to absolute zero. Three figures emerged from the stone, wraith-like entities made of swirling, oily shadows. They had no faces, only voids where their hearts should have been, and they carried blades of solid darkness. The Void Hounds. Protect the relay! The Silas yelled, raising his plasma cutter. The battle was a nightmare of sound and light. Silas fired his last 3 charges, the blue bolts dissipating against the shadow hulls of the hounds like water hitting a hot stove. One of the entities lunged at him, its blade whistling toward his throat. Suddenly, Silas felt a surge of energy, the most intense yet. His vision went white as Vesper and Eris poured everything they had into the bond. His muscles bulged, his reflexes accelerating to a superhuman level. He caught the shadow blade with his bare hand, the ion-shielding flannel smoking as the darkness tried to eat through the lead core threads. With a roar of pure human stubbornness, Silas punched the hound in its featureless face. His fist, reinforced by the Argent energy, hit with the force of a falling moon. The shadow dissipated in a cloud of black mist. 2 more! Silas gasped, his lungs burning with a fire that felt like it was consuming his very soul. He moved like a dervish, a blurring shadow of red flannel and blue energy. He was no longer a mechanic. He was the hammer of the Argent lattice. He tackled the second hound, pinning it to the floor while Eris unleashed a pulse of logic fire from the spire that burned the entity out of existence. But the third hound was faster. It bypassed Silas, heading straight for the relay. Its blade was raised, ready to shatter the crystalline spire and erase the names of the Argent people forever. "No!" Vesper screamed. She threw herself in front of the spire, her small body a fragile shield against the darkness. The hound didn't hesitate. It plunged its blade into her chest. Silas felt the impact as if it had happened to him. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in his heart, and he fell to his knees, vomiting blood. The Ethelbond was screaming, a high-pitched siren of agony that threatened to shatter his mind. Vesper slumped to the floor, her blue skin turning gray. The silver light in her eyes was fading. "Vesper!" Silas crawled toward her, his movements jerky and slow. The third hound turned its attention to him, its blade dripping with Vesper's silver essence. It loomed over him, the personification of Malakor's cold, efficient cruelty. "Your turn, human," the hound hissed, its voice 1,000 whispers of dust. Silas looked at Vesper, then at Eris, who was frozen in horror at the relay. He felt a cold, hard resolve settle in his chest. He reached into his pocket and found the broken half of his favorite wrench. "You want some energy?" Silas whispered, his eyes turning a brilliant, terrifying blue. "Take it all." He didn't sever the bond. He opened it. He threw wide the gates of his own vitality, offering every second of his remaining life to the lattice. A pillar of pure white light erupted from Silas, so powerful that it blew the third hound back against the wall. The light flooded into Vesper, her wounds sealing instantly as the sheer volume of Silas's life force overwhelmed the darkness. The third hound shrieked as it was consumed by the light, its shadow hull evaporating like mist in a summer sun. The vault fell silent. The light receded, leaving the room in a soft, dim glow. Silas lay on his back, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He couldn't move. He couldn't even feel his own limbs. He was a hollow shell, a battery that had been drained to the last milliamp. Eris and Vesper knelt over him, their faces blurred by his failing vision. "The download is complete," Eris whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "The names are safe. Our people are remembered." "Silas?" Vesper took his hand. It was cold. "Silas, please stay. Don't go into the static." Silas tried to smile, but his face wouldn't follow the command. "Did I fix it?" "You fixed everything," Vesper sobbed, pressing his cold hand to her cheek. "Good," Silas whispered, his voice a mere ghost of a sound. "Then, the job's done." His eyes closed, and for the first time in 38 years, the noise in his head finally went quiet. The first thing Silas Vane felt when he clawed his way back to consciousness was the taste of ozone and copper. It was the flavor of a short-circuited fuse, which was a fitting description for his current mental state. He opened his eyes expecting the pearly gates or the fiery pits of some mechanical hell, but instead he found the cold, crystalline ceiling of the Vault of Echoes. "He is returning to the frequency," a voice whispered. It was Eris, her tone stripped of its usual logical detachment. It sounded raw, almost fragile. Silas tried to sit up, but his body felt like it was made of lead and bad intentions. Every joint groaned. When he finally managed to prop himself on one elbow, he caught a glimpse of his hands. They weren't just pale anymore. Beneath the skin, faint silver lines traced his veins like a circuit board, pulsing with a dim, rhythmic light. "Great," Silas rasped, his voice sounding like a shovel dragging over gravel. "I'm a neon sign now. Just what I wanted for my retirement." "Silas!" Vesper threw her arms around his neck, nearly knocking him back into the dirt. She was sobbing, silver tears leaving shimmering trails down her blue cheeks. "You were dark. For 340 seconds, you were completely dark. We had to feed the bond from the spire just to keep your heart from stalling." Silas gently patted her mercury hair, his fingers tingling with a strange, static energy. 340 seconds. That's nearly 6 minutes of me being a non-functional unit. I hope you didn't touch my tools while I was out. Eris knelt beside him, her expression a complex map of guilt and wonder. Silas, by opening the gates to your own vitality, you didn't just save Vesper. You initiated a reverse sync. You are no longer just an anchor. You are a node. The Argent data is now physically woven into your biology. You are more than human and significantly less than Argent. I'm a hybrid scrap heap, Silas grumbled, finally finding the strength to stand. He wobbled for a moment, his balance recalibrating. So what's the damage? Am I going to explode if I stand too close to a microwave? You are stabilized, Eris said, her hand lingering near the silver veins on his arm. But the cost was absolute. The life force you expended was replaced by lattice energy. You will live, Silas, but you are now permanently resonant with us. If we fall, you fall. There is no severing the bond now. I figured that ship had sailed when I started punching shadow monsters, Silas said, reaching for his rucksack. He found Barnaby, the thermos, lying in the dust. It was dented, the lid cracked, but he tucked it under his arm like a priceless heirloom. All right, ladies, we've got the names, we've got the hybrid power, and I've got a massive headache. We need to bug out of this hole before Malakor decides to turn the whole sublevel into a parking lot. Leaving the vault felt different than entering it. The crystals didn't seem to lean in menacingly anymore. They seemed to hum in a low, respectful chord as Silas passed. He was one of them now, or at least a very rough translation. They climbed through the service shafts of the unmapped zones, Silas leading the way with a newfound terrifying speed. His reflexes were twitchy, his senses sharpened to a jagged edge. He could hear the hum of distant power grids and the faint, rhythmic ticking of the moon's geothermal heart. Movement ahead, Silas whispered, his hand going to his plasma cutter. They emerged into a wide gallery overlooking a massive smelting pit. Below them, a dozen habrats, the desperate scavengers of the sink, were huddling together, surrounded by a squad of Union sector drones. The clankers weren't firing. They were herding the humans like livestock toward a heavy lift transport. What are they doing? Vesper asked, her eyes wide with horror. Clean up, Silas spat. Malakor doesn't want witnesses. He's rounding up the local meat so he can sanitize the sector. He calls it formatting. I call it a massacre. Among the prisoners, Silas saw a familiar toad-like figure. Grak was there, his three eyes bulging with terror, his fine silk robes torn and covered in soot. Beside him was Jax, the man from the alleyway, looking more like a ghost than a human. We have to help them, Vesper said, her hand glowing with a sudden angry blue. We've got 10 clankers and a heavy lift shuttle, Silas calculated, his mind running through tactical variables at a speed that made his head spin. And we're 300 meters up. It's a suicide run. The logic dictates that we should proceed to the surface, Eris said, her eyes fixed on the scene below. The mission is the survival of the lattice. Saving 12 primitives will not restore our civilization. Silas turned to her, the silver light in his veins flashing in angry violet. Primitives? Eris, those primitives are the reason this moon still has a pulse. They're scrapheads, drifters, and losers, sure. But they're my people. And if the logic says we let them die to save some data, then your lattice isn't worth building. Eris flinched, her silver eyes shimmering. Silas realized he wasn't just angry. He was hurt. He had chosen them, and he had expected them to understand that the choice was the whole point. Family isn't just about who shares your blood or your energy code, Eris, Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. It's about who you refuse to leave behind. I didn't save you two because of some cosmic destiny. I saved you because you were cold and alone. Just like them. Eris looked at the prisoners below, then back at Silas. The cold, analytical wall in her mind seemed to crack. I am experiencing a secondary resonance. It is not logical. It is painful. That's called a conscience, sweetheart, Silas said, checking the power pack on his cutter. Welcome to humanity. It's a messy, expensive hobby, but the perks are great. Trust someone. How shall we proceed, husband? Vesper asked, a fierce grin spreading across her face. We do it the Wyoming way, Silas said, loud, messy, and with a total disregard for the warranty. The attack was a blur of silver light and blue fire. Silas dropped from the catwalk first, his argent-reinforced legs absorbing the impact of a 30-meter fall with a dull thud. He didn't wait for the drones to calibrate. He was a whirlwind of red flannel, punching through the chassis of the nearest clanker with a fist that hit like an industrial press. Eris and Vesper followed, descending like twin stars. Eris didn't use fire. She used the drone's own systems against them. She touched the central command relay of the squad, and 5 drones immediately turned their Gatling lasers on their own ranks. Vesper moved through the prisoners, her light acting as a protective shield, deflecting the desperate return fire from the remaining Union guards. "Silas!" Grax screamed, falling to his knees as the mechanic tore the head off a Mark III security bot. "I knew you were a high roller. I always said you were my favorite tenant." "Shut up and run for the service tunnels, Grack!" Silas yelled, firing a plasma burst that melted the lock on the transport's cage. "If I see you again, I'm charging you for the damage to my toaster." The battle was over in less than 3 minutes. The sector drones were scrap. The guards had bugged out into the darkness, and 12 terrified hab rats were staring at Silas as if he were a ghost. You're Vane," Jax wheezed, clutching a piece of jagged metal. "What happened to you, man? You're glowing like a supernova." "Just a little overclocking, Jax," Silas said, his chest heaving as the energy began to drain back into the bond. "Get these people to the deep sinks. The Union won't follow you there. They've got bigger fish to fry." As the prisoners scrambled into the shadows, Silas felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Eris. She wasn't looking at the data streams or the mission parameters. She was looking at Grack, who had paused at the tunnel entrance to look back at Silas with a weird, watery expression in his 3 eyes. "They are grateful," Eris whispered. "Grateful doesn't pay the rent," Silas said, trying to regain his cynical edge. But the silver light in his veins was too warm for a lie. "But it feels a hell of a lot better than being a camouflaged battery." "You have changed the trajectory," Eris said, her voice soft. "By choosing to save the irrelevant, you have redefined the lattice. It is no longer a collection of names. It is a collection of choices." "Yeah, well, we've still got the final exam coming up," Silas said, looking toward the ceiling. Far above them, he could feel the massive, heavy weight of a dreadnought entering the upper atmosphere. Malakor's here, and he's not going to be happy that his formatting was interrupted. They began the long climb to the surface. Silas didn't feel like a mechanic anymore. He felt like a man who had finally found the right tool for the job, even if that tool was his own life. The surface of Karis was a nightmare of frozen methane and razor-sharp obsidian ridges. But tonight, the horizon was dominated by something even colder. Malakor's dreadnought, the Entropy's Edge, hung in the sky like a giant, jagged tooth, its black hull absorbing the faint light of the distant stars. It was a 3-kilometer slab of architectural arrogance, and it was currently hovering directly over the Karis main processing hub. Silas, Eris, and Vesper crouched on a ridge of black glass, looking down at the hub. The facility was crawling with wraiths and overseer-class legionnaires, beings that looked more like suits of empty armor than living creatures. "He is waiting," Eris said, her silver hair whipping in the sub-zero wind. "He has established a localized dampening field. He knows we are coming. He wants us to see the end." "He's got a big ship," Silas noted, his teeth chattering despite the argent heat. "But big ships have big blind spots, and I know every vent, every exhaust port, and every structural weakness of this hub. I spent 10 years keeping the plumbing from exploding." "Silas," Vesper said, her voice trembling, "I see a future. I see the light. And then I see nothing. Just blackness." "That's just the methane fog, kid," Silas said, though he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Don't let the foresight psych you out. The future is just a bunch of variables waiting for a wrench to be thrown into them." They moved toward the secondary maintenance hangar, a rusted, half-collapsed building that the Union had abandoned years ago. Inside, Silas found what he was looking for, the Wyoming Special. It was an old Type 9 industrial excavator, a 40-ton beast of yellow steel and hydraulic lines. It looked like a dinosaur in a graveyard of high-tech debris. Silas had found it months ago and had been slowly restoring it in his spare time, mostly because he liked the way the engine roared like a caged animal. "You intend to fight a dreadnought with a Digging machine? Eris asked, her scientific mind clearly struggling with the concept. It's not just a digging machine, Silas said, climbing into the operator's cabin. He patted the dashboard, which was covered in a layer of fine gray dust. It's a 40-ton kinetic impact delivery system, and with a little help from my lovely wives, it's going to be the most dangerous thing on this moon. For the next 4 hours, the hangar was a whirlwind of hybrid engineering. Silas directed the repairs with a manic energy, his silver veins pulsing with every command. Eris integrated the argent power cells they'd salvaged from the vault, weaving them into the excavator's hydraulic systems. Vesper worked on the frontal bucket, reinforcing the steel with a crystalline lattice that turned the yellow metal into a shimmering, unbreakable blue. I've rigged the main drill to a focused ion discharge, Silas said, his face covered in grease and silver energy residue. It'll cut through the entropy's edge's outer shielding like a hot knife through butter. But we only get one shot. Once we're inside the dampening field, we're running on whatever juice we've got left in our cells. As they finished the final calibrations, a shimmering holographic projection materialized in the center of the hangar. It was Malakor. The overseer was a towering figure, his body a seamless blend of dark, non-reflective metal and pale, translucent skin. His eyes were voids, two pits of absolute darkness that seemed to swallow the light around him. Silas Vane, the projection spoke, its voice a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in the floorboards. A human mechanic, a creature of dirt and fleeting desires, you have caused a minor delay in the inevitable. I'm a busy man, Malakor, Silas said, not looking up from his welding. I don't have time for the all-is-lost monologue. I've heard better speeches from my coffee pot. Malakor's gaze shifted to Eris and Vesper. Princesses. You cling to this primitive anchor as if his mortality could protect you. You are the last echoes of a failed experiment. If you surrender now, I will allow the human to live. I will return him to his mundane existence, and he will die peacefully in his sleep, 40 years from now, never knowing the touch of starlight again. Silas stopped welding. The hangar went quiet, save for the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen scrubber. He looked at Eris and Vesper. He saw the hesitation in Eris's eyes. She was thinking about the 40 years. She was thinking about the life she had taken from him. He saw the heartbreak in Vesper, her silver eyes filled with a desperate, agonizing love. He's offering you a deal, Silas, Eris whispered. A long life, a quiet life, the life you had before the storm. Silas walked over to the projection, his heavy boots clanking on the metal floor. He stood toe-to-toe with the image of the most powerful being in the sector. You know, Malakor, Silas said, his voice deceptively soft. You've got a lot of data in that head of yours, but you're missing the most important variable. And what is that, human? A mechanic knows that sometimes a part is so worn out, so tired, and so broken that it doesn't want to be fixed back to its original state, Silas said. He knows that sometimes that part wants to be forged into something new, something that matters. He reached out, his silver-veined hand passing through the hologram. I was a mundane nobody for 38 years, Silas said, his voice rising with a fierce, defiant pride. I was a cog that didn't fit anywhere. But these two, they didn't just use me as a battery. They gave me a reason to wake up in the morning. They gave me a family. And you can't format a family, you son of a bitch. Silas turned his back on the projection and climbed into the cabin of the Wyoming Special. Ladies, Silas barked, man your stations. Eris, you're on the energy distribution. Vesper, you're on the foresight and shields. Barnaby, you stay in the cup holder. The hologram of Malakor flickered and vanished, his void eyes narrowing in a silent promise of annihilation. The Wyoming Special roared to life. It wasn't the sound of a mining tool. It was the sound of a planet waking up. The silver energy coils hummed, the blue reinforced bucket glowed, and the massive drill began to spin with a high-pitched, harmonic shriek. The dampening field is active, Eris reported, her hands glowing as she merged with the excavator's controls. We are losing external communication. We are alone. Good, Silas said, slamming the machine into gear. I always work better without a supervisor. The hangar doors blew outward as 40 tons of hybrid fury charged into the methane snow. The entropy's edge responded instantly, its underside turrets rotating to track the yellow dot on the landscape. A volley of shadow bolts slammed into the ground around them, turning the obsidian ridges into molten slag. "Shields at 60%, Vesper yelled, her eyes flashing with flashes of the immediate future. "Move left, Silas! Now!" Silas yanked the control levers, the excavator sliding sideways on its anti-grav treads, just as a massive beam of darkness vaporized the ridge where they'd been a second before. They were a kilometer from the hub, then 500 meters. The entropy's edge was lowering itself, its massive gravity well beginning to crush the surrounding buildings. "The main docking bay is opening," Eris called out. "He is launching the Void Hounds." "Let him come," Silas grunted, his eyes fixed on the massive black hull above. "I've got a hole to dig." He pushed the throttle to the firewall. The Wyoming Special didn't just move, it leaped. Using the anti-grav treads as boosters, the excavator flew over the perimeter wall, the blue reinforced buckets smashing through a squad of Union legionnaires like they were tin cans. The heavy lift doors of the dreadnought loomed ahead, a massive yawning mouth of dark steel. Silas triggered the ion discharge. A beam of pure, brilliant silver energy erupted from the drill, slamming into the entropy's edge's hangar shield. The shield didn't just buckle, it shattered. The feedback wave sent a surge of energy through the excavator, blowing out half the displays and sending a spray of sparks across Silas's face. "We're in!" Silas yelled, the Wyoming Special crashing onto the hangar floor of the dreadnought. The air inside the ship was cold and dead, filled with the hum of a billion stolen memories. Silas looked around the vast hangar, seeing rows of stasis pods and piles of plundered technology. "Malakor's throne room is 3 levels up," Eris said, her voice shaking with the intensity of the bond. "Silas, the energy drain is accelerating. The ship's core is trying to consume us." "Then we'd better finish this quick," Silas said, bringing the massive drill back to life. He didn't follow the ramps or the elevators. He looked at the ceiling. "Hey, Eris!" Silas grinned, the silver light in his eyes now a steady, brilliant white. "You ever seen a 40-ton excavator do a vertical ascent?" "The physics are impossible," Eris said, though she was already rerouting the power to the anti-grav treads. "Physics is just a suggestion, sweetheart," Silas said. "In Wyoming, we call this digging for gold." The Wyoming Special reared back, its treads glowing blue as it defied the ship's gravity. The drill slammed into the ceiling, the ion discharge melting the titanium alloy as if it were wax. They were no longer running. They were ascending through the very heart of the enemy. As they tore through the second floor, Silas felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest. His vision flickered. The silver veins on his arms were beginning to smoke, the human skin unable to contain the sheer volume of lattice energy. "Silas, stop!" Vesper cried, reaching for his hand. "You're burning up. The bond is at 300% capacity." "Just a little." "Further," Silas wheezed, his hands shaking on the levers. "I told you, I don't walk away until the job's finished." He looked at Eris and Vesper, his family, and he realized that the pain didn't matter. The 40 years didn't matter. What mattered was the choice he had made in the snow, and the choice he was making now. With one final desperate roar of the engine, the Wyoming Special burst through the floor of the throne room. Malakor stood at the far end of the chamber, his void eyes wide with a genuine, terrifying surprise. He was surrounded by a swirling cloud of silver data, the stolen history of 1,000 worlds. You dare?" Malakor's voice was no longer a hum. It was a shriek of outraged logic. "I told you, Malakor," Silas said, stepping out of the smoking cabin of the excavator, his flannel shirt charred, his eyes burning with the light of a dying star. "I'm the mechanic, and you're the part that needs to be replaced." The throne room of the Entropy's Edge was a cathedral of cold, calculated silence. It wasn't just a place of power. It was a physical manifestation of Malakor's philosophy, vast, empty, and devoid of a single jagged edge. The silver data streams swirling in the center of the chamber looked like ghosts caught in a whirlpool, a billion voices reduced to a singular, shimmering hum. Malakor stood at the center, his void eyes pulsing with a rhythmic, dark light. He looked at the Wyoming Special, the 40-ton yellow excavator that had just burrowed through 3 decks of his masterwork, and for the first time in 10,000 years, he seemed to experience the data equivalent of a headache. "You have compromised the structural integrity of this vessel, human," Malakor spoke, his voice no longer a whisper, but a booming vibration that shook the very foundations of the ship. "You have introduced entropic noise into a system of perfect order. Why do you persist in this illogical struggle? You are already a dead man walking." Silas Vane stepped out of the smoking cabin, his boots hitting the polished obsidian floor with a heavy, unrefined thud. He looked like hell warmed over. His flannel shirt was a scorched rag. His skin was webbed with pulsing silver veins that glowed with a terrifying intensity, and his eyes were no longer brown, but 2 pits of brilliant, unstable starlight. "I'm a mechanic, Malakor," Silas wheezed, leaning against the excavator's bucket for support. "I don't mind a little noise. It's the silence that usually means something's about to blow up." Beside him, Eris and Vesper emerged from the cabin. They were no longer the fragile refugees he'd found in the snow. They were radiant, their energy signatures merged with Silas's in a singular, roaring flame of lattice power. The ethel bond wasn't just a link anymore. It was a circuit, and Silas was the breaker. "The data you stole," Eris said, her voice echoing with the authority of her entire race. "The names, the songs, the history, it is not yours to format. You cannot erase the architecture of a soul. A soul is merely a collection of recurring subroutines," Malakor countered, raising a hand. From the floor, a swarm of void hounds emerged, oily, shadow-like entities that began to circle the 3 of them. "I am not erasing them. I am optimizing them. I am removing the friction of individuality to create a singular, eternal peace." "Peace?" Silas laughed, coughing up a spray of silver-tinged blood. "That ain't peace, pal. That's a flatline. I've seen enough machines stop working to know the difference." Malakor didn't waste any more words. He gestured and the void hounds lunged. "Vesper, shields!" Silas roared. Vesper threw her hands out, and a shimmering blue dome erupted from her, reinforced by Silas's raw vitality. The shadow creatures slammed into the barrier, their blades of darkness shattering against the resonance of the ethel bond. But the drain was immense. Silas felt his heart skip a beat, the silver veins in his arms glowing so bright they felt like they were burning through his flesh. "The ship's core," Eris cried out, pointing toward the central pillar of data. "He's using the lattice energy to power the localized dampening field. If we don't sever the link, the bond will consume you within 60 seconds. "Then let's stop being subtle," Silas grunted. He reached into the excavator's cabin and pulled out his heavy-duty welding rig, which he'd modified with a piece of the argentite crystal. "Eris, give me a frequency, something that'll jam his central logic." "It would need to be something completely irrational," Eris said, her eyes wide. "Something his algorithms cannot process." Silas grinned, his teeth white against his soot-stained face. "I've spent 38 years being irrational. I've got this." He didn't fire the rig at the hounds. He fired it at Malakor himself. But it wasn't a beam of energy. It was a transmission. Through the ethel bond, Silas flooded the room with his own memories. He didn't send them the grand, noble thoughts of a hero. He sent the messy, grimy, beautiful junk of a human life. He sent the smell of burnt coffee at 4 in the morning. He sent the frustration of a stripped bolt that wouldn't budge. He sent the lonely silence of a Wyoming winter, the feeling of his first heartbreak, and the stubborn, stupid pride he felt when he finally got an old engine to turn over. He sent the memory of talking to Barnaby for 3 years because he was too afraid to be alone. Malakor recoiled as the dirty data hit him. The void hounds flickered and dissipated, their forms unable to maintain cohesion against the flood of raw, human imperfection. "What is this?" Malakor hissed, his void eyes flashing a frantic red. "This data is useless. It is garbage. It is noise. It's called life, you oversized calculator," Silas yelled, stepping forward. "It's the friction you're so afraid of. It's the reason we don't just sit in the dark and wait to die." The throne room began to shake. The entropy's edge was losing its hold on reality. The data streams in the central pillar were starting to spiral outward, returning to the people they belonged to. "You are destroying the vessel!" Malakor shrieked, his form beginning to blur. "We will all burn in the atmosphere of this wretched moon." "Better to burn than to be formatted," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, steady rumble. With one final superhuman effort, Silas lunged at Malakor. He didn't use a weapon. He used the bond. He grabbed the overseer with his silver-veined hands, and for one heartbeat, the two of them were one. Malakor saw everything: the choice in the snow, the sacrifice in the vault, and the terrifying, beautiful realization that Silas Vane loved these two alien sisters more than his own life. Malakor couldn't process the love. It was the ultimate glitch. A pillar of pure white light erupted from the center of the throne room, blasting outward with the force of a supernova. The entropy's edge shrieked as its central core was overloaded by the surge of irrational, human vitality. Silas felt himself falling. He felt the heat of the atmospheric entry, the sound of tearing metal, and the distant melodic crying of Eris and Vesper. He felt the bond stretching, thinning, but never breaking. Then there was only the whiteout. When the light finally receded, Silas found himself lying in the snow. Not the blue methane snow of the unmapped zones, but the soft, white powder of the Carrie's surface. The storm had passed. The sky was clear, revealing a sea of stars that looked closer than they ever had before. A few hundred meters away, the wreckage of the entropy's edge lay scattered across the obsidian ridges like a broken toy. It wasn't a dreadnought anymore. It was just a pile of scrap metal. Eris and Vesper were kneeling beside him, their blue skin glowing softly in the starlight. They were whole. They were safe. Silas tried to speak, but his throat felt like it was full of glass. He looked at his hands. The silver veins were still there, but they were dim now, a permanent part of his map. He was a mechanic who had been rebuilt, and he knew he'd never be the same again. "The data," Silas managed to wheeze. "Is it?" "It is dispersed," Eris said, a silver tear falling on his cheek. "The names have returned to the echoes. The lattice is no longer a memory. It is a possibility." From the shadows of the wreckage, figures began to emerge. The 12 prisoners they'd rescued from the sink were walking toward them, led by Jax and a very disheveled Grack. They looked at the wreckage, then at the glowing mechanic in the snow. "You did it, Vane," Jax said, his voice trembling with awe. "You actually took down the big one." "Yeah, well," Silas said, closing his eyes and letting the cold air fill his lungs. "I had a couple of good assistants." Grack stepped forward, looking at the silver lines on Silas's face. The toad-like landlord didn't talk about rent or credits. He simply took off his torn silk cloak and draped it over Silas's shivering frame. "The heat bill for this month is going to be astronomical, Silas," Grack whispered, his 3 eyes unusually soft. "But I think we can work out a payment plan." Silas smiled. It was a small, painful thing, but it was real. He had spent his life thinking he was a nobody, a piece of discarded hardware in a galaxy of shiny machines. But as he lay there in the Wyoming-like snow of a distant moon, surrounded by a landlord, a scavenger, and 2 alien princesses, he realized he had finally found the one thing he'd been searching for in every scrap pile on Carrie's. He had found home. 6 months had passed since the entropy's edge rained down on Karis like a shower of falling stars. The moon wasn't the same place it used to be. The ion storms were still there, and the air was still cold enough to freeze a man's thoughts. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of a graveyard. It was the silence of a workshop before the first hammer falls. Silas Vane stood in the center of the newly christened Lattice Hub, which used to be the Karis main processing facility. It was no longer a sterile Union outpost. It was a chaotic, thriving mess of human and Argent engineering. High-tech energy conduits were held together by industrial-grade duct tape, and ancient mining drones were being retrofitted with silver resonance cores. Silas himself had changed the most. He was 38 years old, but he carried himself with the weary grace of a man who had seen the beginning and the end of a world. The silver veins on his face and arms had settled into a permanent, elegant pattern that glowed whenever he was working hard or whenever Eris and Vesper were nearby. He didn't have a supervisor anymore. He was the supervisor. Status on the atmospheric scrubbers, Jax, Silas yelled, his voice echoing through the massive hangar. Holding steady at 98%, boss, Jax called back from a catwalk 40 meters above. The new filters Eris designed are working like a charm. We've got breathable air all the way down to sub-level 5. Good, tell the crew to take 15. Silas wiped a smudge of grease and silver energy from his forehead. He walked over to a small, quiet corner of the hangar, where a familiar object sat on a pedestal made of refined quartz. It was Barnaby. The thermos was still dented, still cracked, but it was now a historical artifact. It sat there as a reminder that the greatest revolution in the sector had started with a cup of mediocre coffee and a man who refused to be alone. Eris appeared at his side, her movements as silent as starlight. She was wearing a pair of modified coveralls over her argent robes, her hands covered in the same gray dust that coated Silas's. She looked like a queen who had discovered the joy of manual labor. The first colonial transport from the Outer Rim has entered the system, Eris reported, her voice no longer a series of logical chimes, but a warm, human-like melody. There are over 300 families on board, humans, Valonians, and even a few surviving Argent who heard the resonance. 300 families, Silas mused, taking a sip of coffee from a new, significantly less dented thermos. That's a lot of broken toasters, Eris. You sure we're ready for this? We are builders, Silas, Eris said, leaning her head against his shoulder. The silver veins on their skin pulsed in a perfect, synchronized rhythm. And as you taught us, a good builder never walks away from a job until it is finished. Vesper skated toward them on a pair of anti-grav boots she'd cobbled together from a seeker drone's remains. She was laughing, her silver hair trailing behind her like a comet's tail. She skidded to a halt, spraying a shower of fine ice crystals over Silas's boots. Silas, the kids in the sink want to know if you're still going to teach them how to fix a crawler engine this afternoon. Tell them I'll be there at 4 o'clock sharp, Silas grunted, though his eyes were crinkling with a smile. And tell them if they bring any of that neon soda, they're doing extra duty on the filter cleaning. Vesper saluted him with a cheeky grin and zoomed off into the distance. Silas watched her go, then looked around at the world he'd helped build. It wasn't perfect. It was messy, it was loud, and it was constantly in need of repair. But for the first time in his life, it was his. He walked to the edge of the hangar's viewing portal, looking out at the vast, dark plains of Karis. In the distance, he could see the first lights of the new settlement, the lights of people who had chosen to be here, who had chosen each other. Silas took a deep breath, the cold air no longer stinging his lungs but filling him with a strange, vibrant strength. He looked back at his journey, from the lonely mechanic in a battered Chevy crawler to the man who held the resonance of a civilization in his veins. I used to think that being a mechanic meant knowing how to put things back exactly the way they were before they broke. I thought that if you had a blueprint and enough spare parts, you could fix anything in the galaxy. I spent 38 years talking to a thermos because I figured that if a person was broken, they were just scrap metal. You couldn't fix a heart that had been formatted by the cold. But I was wrong. These past 6 months have taught me that the best things in life, the things worth keeping, don't come from a blueprint. They come from the friction. They come from the messy, illogical choices we make when everything tells us to just walk away. I chose to save 2 strangers in a storm. They chose to anchor their entire world to a guy who lived in a tin can. And together we chose to build something out of the wreckage that Malakor couldn't understand. He thought he could erase the names of 1 billion people, but he didn't realize that a name is just a label. It's the choice to stand beside someone, to hold their hand when the light is fading, and to call them family even when the law says they're just data. That's what makes us real. I'm still a mechanic. I still have grease under my fingernails and a temperamental heater in my hab unit. But I'm not a nobody anymore. I'm a part of the mesh. And I've realized that the universe isn't a machine to be optimized. It's a project to be shared. It's a big, beautiful, broken thing that we get to fix, one choice at a time. And as long as I've got my family and a decent wrench, I reckon I'm the luckiest man in the stars. Silas stepped away from the window, his hand lingering on the glass for a moment. The silver light in his veins was a steady, warm glow, a map of the choices he had made. He felt the ethel bond thrumming in his heart, a constant reminder that he was never truly alone again. He looked at Barnaby on its pedestal, then out at the busy hangar. He saw a human engineer sharing a tool with an Argent researcher, both of them arguing about the best way to bypass a power surge. He saw Grack helping a child fix a broken toy. He saw a world that was being built not by logic, but by choice. "Everything has a price," Silas whispered to the empty air. "But some things are worth paying for." He turned back to the hangar, the silver light reflecting in his eyes. I spent so long thinking my life was just a series of accidents and broken parts. But looking at all this, I have to ask, have you ever felt like you were just a spare part waiting for the right machine? And then one day someone chose to pick you up and use you to build something that changed everything? Who are the people in your life that chose you when they didn't have to? He didn't wait for an answer from the universe. He had work to do. Silas Vane picked up his heavy-duty wrench, the one he'd forged from the wreckage of the dreadnought, and walked toward the next broken engine with a whistle on his lips.